Hello, and welcome to the Cambridge PhDcasts. Today, Mark King is going to be speaking to us about his research into Richard II. So, Mark, if you'd like to give us a bit of an introduction to your subject.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, John. So, I work on the reign of Richard II, the political history of the reign. Richard II was a late 14th century English monarch who ends up being deposed. Mm-hmm. And to explain what I'm doing, it's necessary to give you just a little bit of background on late medieval kingship in general, and things like that.
Take it away.
So, government during the later Middle Ages in England is really all about kingship. By the late 14th century, the king sits at the head of a relatively sophisticated bureaucracy for its time, and his authority over this is absolute. The more modern idea of particularly based on what happens during the Wars of the Roses, of the king being able to be challenged by his nobility, of them being able to remove kings at will effectively without any sort of repercussions, that's actually inaccurate. You know, that's based on a particular set of circumstances and shouldn't be taken as a reflection of the general state of kingship during this period. However, the English people, the English political society, does hold the right to hold their ruler to account if they deem him to have failed in his duties or to have behaved tyrannically, for example. Mm-hmm. And there's a long tradition of legitimate opposition to a monarch who's deemed to be either inadequate or despotic, And I mean, there are numerous sort of statements of rights of the English political community, the most obvious one of which, of course, is Magna Carta. And this is all about the way in which this relationship between the king and his subjects gradually becomes more defined as the period goes on. And by the late 14th century, this is very nicely defined, to the extent that we do have examples of kings being opposed, and even in some extreme cases of kings being deposed by their subjects. But that's very rare, and that's more a reflection of a period of prolonged misrule. Mm-hmm. So whenever one studies a king who does end up being deposed, the fundamental question, of course, is to ask, well, what had that monarch done that was so awful to warrant this? And for all that I'm working on quite a specific aspect of the king's policy, this is nevertheless effectively the fundamental question that I'm trying to answer.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm looking forward to getting onto this and how things do break down during Richard's reign. But maybe before that, can you give us a little bit of background on Richard, how he comes to the throne, his early years?
Yeah. So Richard's the grandson of the previous king, Edward III. He comes to the throne in 1377 as a 10-year-old boy. He inherits not his father, because his father was the Black Prince who had already died during Edward III's reign. So as I say, Richard comes to the throne as a child, therefore he's not immediately in control of the government. However, by the early sort of 1380s, about 5 years into the reign, we start to see signs of his personal participation. At the same time, however, it's apparent that he has already started to fall out with a number of his most prominent noblemen, for various different reasons. Instead, Richard appears to have been very close to a small group of men from within his household, some of whom are minor nobility, but most of whom are knights, effectively. And as the 1380s progress, the king starts to lavish his patronage upon these men, to give them grants of lands, offices, titles, etc., to invest them with quite considerable private power in various different regions of the realm, and also to give some of them control over governmental policy in various ways. One of them, for example, becomes chancellor. One particular sphere in which they effectively seize control is of foreign policy, because at this time England is fighting the 100 Years' War against France, and you see a number of these men clearly having an effect on the policies that England's pursuing and the way in which England effectively sort of tries to appease France throughout this period rather than pursuing an aggressive stance in the war. Now, by 1386, this division between Richard's household men and most of the rest of the nobility has become very well defined, and quite and very aggressive in many ways. And in the autumn of 1386, the government is taken out of Richard's hands by a group of noblemen who oppose the household knights. And this happens because of the failure of the policies that these men have been pursuing. In particular, in the war, the government's policy has failed entirely to contain the French threat, to the extent that by early 1386, really, England is facing both a financial crisis and the imminent threat of a French invasion. Mm-hmm. So the nobility responds, government is taken out of Richard's hands. And the king's response to this then engenders a far deeper political crisis. Richard responds by leaving the capital, by effectively going off in a sulk, and going on a sort of a tour of his realm, retaining knights and esquires as he goes, and effectively trying to build up a private army.
Which is not normal.
Which is not normal behaviour in any way. Yeah, I'll talk about the sort of the nature of the medieval state and what this means for its use of manpower in a minute. But as I say, this is profoundly unusual. What he also does is to call a number of the justices of the realm before him and to ask them a series of loaded questions, whereby he can charge those members of the nobility who've taken the government out of his hands with treason. He's effectively, making a very clear threat to the life and limb of these men. Nobility responds as you'd expect, by recruiting their own force, and they defeat the Ricardian army at a place called Radcott Bridge in Oxfordshire. After this, they return to London, and according to one chronicle, they temporarily depose the king. He's removed for 3 days before they can't agree on who should replace him, and this is because at this moment Richard doesn't have an heir.
What age is Richard at this point?
Oh, he's in his late teens.
He's in his late teens.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Richard's removed for 3 days, but then reinstated when they can't agree on who should succeed him instead, and when they realise that they've perhaps gone a bit far. Instead, they settle for a policy of carrying out a purge of the household, of removing a number of these men who they think were having such a negative influence over Richard during his childhood.
When you say removing,
I mean removing. They call Parliament, and they proceed in cases of impeachment and ultimately treason against these men. And those of them who've already fled the country are condemned in their exile and remain in exile perpetually. Those who are still present and can be found are generally executed.
Okay.
Their lands
so this is a pretty clear statement.
Yeah, this is a very clear statement. This is quite a bloodbath. And obviously this has a knock-on effect on politics. The hope on the part of the nobility was clearly that if they removed these men from around the king, they could make a bit of a fresh start of this, hopefully show Richard the error of his ways.
Presumably reassert their own power as well.
To an extent. But I mean, the actual period of time in which they have control of the government is very limited before, as I say, government is all about kingship. Naturally, Richard reasserts his position very quickly and recovers control. But the politics then breaks down into a period of about 10 years when there is clearly considerable tension because everyone's waiting for a resolution of what happened. It feels like that, for all that they wanted a fresh start, it's quite clear that Richard has neither forgiven nor forgotten this, and that he is merely biding his time. Over this period, he starts to pursue a number of policies designed to isolate and to exclude certain of the more prominent of his opponents. And then in 1397, 10 years after the original crisis, he finally leads a coup against them, arrests them, and again calls a parliament and proceeds against them. One of them, a prince of the realm, the king's uncle, is murdered whilst in custody. Another one is exiled, and the last one is executed. Again, all of their lands are forfeit. Richard now takes those lands and distributes them amongst his new sort of group of intimates within his household.
So it's a replay to some extent of what's happened in 1386.
Yeah. But also a replay of very much, as I say, what the king had effectively been doing throughout, albeit on a greater scale. But what he does with a particular section of them is to attach them to his own royal lands in Chester and North Wales and to form a vast landed power base there from which he can recruit considerable manpower. And this effectively becomes the heartland of Richard's rule now. He uses the resources of this power base, particularly the military resources, to impose his rule for the next 2 years.
And this is not, just to stop you briefly there, that's not something that's normal for the period, the Crown controlling vast lands.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. No. The Crown estate by this period does include the Rump Principality of Wales, the Earldom of Chester, and the Duchy of Cornwall, but those are very much normally used as the endowment of the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne. Okay. They're there to give him a sort of apprenticeship whilst he awaits his ultimate succession. They're not used to give the Crown substantial private power. The fact that Richard has them is a result of the fact that he still doesn't have an heir at this date. So it is unusual, and it's particularly unusual for him to then take various noble lands and to attach them to this and to rule in the way that he does. Now, during these following 2 years, He rules tyrannically, there's no two ways about it. He extorts his subjects, he in particular seizes property arbitrarily, and that includes money as well as things. He's infamous for having procured these blank charters, whereby basically various communities, such as the City of London, things like that, would effectively be told that they're going to make a donation to the royal purse.
Interesting.
And you just have to do this.
And you sign up.
And you sign up, exactly. He also pursues mercilessly anyone who he thinks was involved in opposing him 10 years previously.
So even the grudges have been kept from 1387.
Grudges being kept, yes. He charges them extortionate fines for pardons. He hauls several of them before many of them before the council in order to begin proceedings against them. This is characteristic of Richard's rule during this period. Finally, in 1399, he goes too far. He seizes the estates of the Duchy of Lancaster, the largest landed inheritance in the realm, after the old Duke, John of Gaunt, dies. Now, in the process, he disinherits his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom he'd exiled to France a year previously. Bolingbroke had gone to France under the understanding that he could sue for his inheritance when his father died. But when Gaunt dies, Richard erases this. Richard says that's cancelled, that's no longer valid, and he seizes the land for himself. Yeah. This effectively demonstrates to everyone that no one is safe. That ultimately, if the king can do this to the heir to the greatest noble house in the realm, anyone can be challenged in this way. Bolingbroke returns with a small band of men to claim his inheritance, but he's immediately welcomed by the people who see him effectively as a saviour from Richard's tyranny. Support for Richard evaporates, barring the few members of his inner circle whom he's sort of created as great noblemen. By this point, no one else is prepared to stand up for Richard. Doesn't even come to a battle, despite the remarkable landed power that the king has managed to accumulate for himself.
He doesn't manage to turn this into any kind of military force.
Yeah, part of the reason for that is that when Bolingbroke returns, Richard is actually away campaigning in Ireland. But when he returns, he finds that it's already evaporated. There's no one who's prepared to fight for him. He's eventually tracked down in North Wales. He's brought back to London, he's deposed, and eventually murdered whilst in Lancastrian custody, which, to be honest, is just the standard practice of what has to happen after a king's been deposed, because otherwise they provide an alternative source of loyalty, a reason for rebellion,
You've got to wipe them out. Yeah.
Exactly. And Bolingbroke claims the throne and founds the House of Lancaster.
So that's a remarkably kind of fluent overview of the period and the crises facing Richard and the nobles in the period. I suppose what I want to ask now is, where does your research fit into this? Because I presume it's not stretching across the entirety of, how do you focus in on this?
Sure. So I'm studying royal policy towards the March of Wales, which is the Welsh borderlands. Now, by the late 14th century, obviously Wales had been conquered, but what remained along the border and in South Wales was a series of these lordships that were left over from the pre-conquest period, when the Normans had steadily encroached upon the various Welsh principalities. And so this was a region of substantial private power for the nobility. Now, elsewhere in England, society's broken down on the manorial system. Noblemen and knights hold various different manors dotted around the country, perhaps more concentrated in certain areas. But in the March of Wales, noblemen hold consolidated block lordships. They are universal landlord within a certain geographical area.
How exactly does that differ from the manorial system? Is it just they have more direct power? Or?
Yeah, they have much more direct power because they effectively own everything within their lordship. They also have a series of subrogalian jurisdictional rights over this.
Does that mean they're essentially princes in their own territory?
Exactly. Yeah. So they hold them from the king, but ultimately within it, the king's writ does not run. It is their government. Okay. Now, this gives them a number of benefits. On the one hand, it tends to make them incredibly wealthy because they have the ability to levy fines effectively over their tenants whenever they want to. Their tenants also only have access to their own court.
To the court run by the
Lord, exactly. Which means the Lord again can charge whatever he wants for decisions made in that court. And so this tends to give them an incredible income. As well as rent payments and everything else that you'd expect. The other benefit that it gives them is it makes them militarily very powerful, because again they have universal recruitment rights over their tenantry. Only they can recruit from within these lordships. And as I say, that many of them are quite big. And, Wales is a recruiting ground for the English kings anyway. People think of the famous Welsh archers, things like that. Well, the March of Lords are bringing a lot of this. These are their retinues from their tenantry.
So this looks very different to a later, what we might call a later state where the military is drawn to the centre.
Yeah. This system continues until the Act of Union under Henry VII, when, because most of these Marcher lordships by this point have actually become part of the Crown estate, he's able to just to remove them and to impose a county system in Wales instead. But back then, you still have these islands of private jurisdiction operating. Now, these are not in any way a threat to the king. These are not a problem. The late medieval monarchy doesn't have substantial private power, as I said earlier. It doesn't have, or it doesn't even have the apparatus of a modern state. It doesn't have something like a standing army or a police force or anything like that. What it does have, however, is the right to call upon the resources of its nobility. The nobility willingly put these resources at the disposal of the king in return for what he does for them, which is effectively to defend them from external and internal aggression, to arbitrate between them in their disputes.
So they do the recruiting, but they can be then called up to serve.
Exactly. Yeah. This essentially is founded in what you might call a feudal relationship between the two. Now, what this means, as I say, is that the nobility's resources are put at the disposal of the king. And for government in the localities, this tends to mean that the nobility act as a sort of form of devolved agency. They are the agents through which royal government is commuted into the localities, and it's them and their men who then tend to execute it. We tend to call this bastard feudalism. What it is the system by which noblemen might retain knights and esquires from the region in which they hold most of their manors. And they will, and then those individual retainers will often staff the offices of local government, things like sheriff, fish eater, etc., so that it's the nobility and their own agents who are acting as the sort of the public face of the king's rule.
So prior to Richard, there isn't this. The king isn't parachuting men in here.
No, absolutely not. No, that's unusual. And as I say, this delegation is fundamental. And within the March, obviously, they are just literally ruling these lordships. But the same principles apply, that ultimately they hold them from the king, and if the king wants to call upon them to fight on a campaign and to bring their tenantry with them, they will do that. These are not a threat to the king. We have to remember that this is a ruling class. Ultimately, they have a community of interests here. They want to preserve the status quo and they want to preserve their own privileged position. It's in no nobleman's interest to go against the king. He will be isolated because the rest of the nobility will allow him to be isolated because he represents a threat by doing so to the established order. It's not in their interest for this to happen. Power and wealth is based upon land, which is inherently fragile. All you need is for a bunch of people to come around and raid your manors, and all of a sudden it's going to take a long time for that to recover. So as I say, we shouldn't see these lordships as a possible threat to the king's authority. But Richard does think they're a threat, or at least Richard does think that in general the private power of his nobility is a threat to his position rather than a resource for him to call upon. Now, this is probably because he falls out with them from so early onwards, and so he just simply doesn't trust a number of them.
What's understanding after seeing those close to him executed or outside?
Yeah, I mean, that as I say, the original fallout is much earlier. It's from a couple of years into the reign, it becomes apparent that he has lost the confidence of a number of them, and that he's starting to lash out at them in various ways, and they're starting to respond in kind. You have public confrontations in Parliament, you have rumours of all sorts of things, plots against members of the nobility that the king was supposedly involved in and everything. This is fundamentally unusual, and this gives you an idea of the sort of tensions which are already beginning to build up within political society. Richard doesn't trust a number of these people, so ultimately he pursues a number of policies throughout the reign to try to get around this. During the 1380s, based primarily on the household. He takes these few household men who he's close to, and he installs them in different areas of the realm with considerable power. He gives
Prior
them
to
lands.
this, they were not substantial landholders.
Very,
on the level
very few
of the
of them. One of them is a nobleman, but he is the lowest. He's the Earl of Oxford in terms of the amount of wealth he commands. He is the lowest of all of the titled nobility.
Obviously, Oxford's traditionally just quite a poor intellectually as well as everything else. Sorry, a brief Cambridge gag there. Sorry, but
I mean, it's the king's prerogative. Ultimately, if he wants to install people with this sort of power, he can do. But if you look at the way he's doing it, he's creating local rivals to members of the nobility who he doesn't trust. And one of the areas in which that he targets is the March of Wales. Now then, during the 1390s, after the noble reaction against this, and after the execution of most of these household men, in the 1390s he realises that if anything, this power base was a bit narrow. He was relying upon too few people. So what he starts to do instead is to retain his own bastard feudal affinity, effectively. And to try to do this across the entire realm, so that in every county,
this on a much grander
scale, so that in every county he has a number of direct local agents that he can use to install in office in the place of those of the local nobility.
Who are his choice and who answer to him rather than to the local.
So that he's trying again to isolate and ultimately to replace in the system of government these members of the nobility. Then, during the tyranny in 1397-9, as I say, this is much more about landed power. And you can see that ultimately this has been what Richard has been aiming at. He wants to be in a position of direct control. He wants to have the power and the private resources that if he feels someone is opposed to him, he can just crush them. Richard is ultimately trying to change the way in which government in the Middle Ages works, fundamentally. He's trying to bypass the nobility. He's trying to replace those members of the nobility whom he doesn't trust with other people. But along the way, in order to do so, he's breaking the law consistently. He's seizing estates arbitrarily. He's trying people with in incredibly dodgy ways. He's not abiding by the principles of judgment by peers. All of these sort of things that are supposedly enshrined in Magna Carta and should be preserved. And so he's breaking all of the rules of kingship effectively as we understand them. And this is what ultimately leads his subjects to abandon him and to depose him. And so, as I say, I'm looking at the March because the March is the region in which he ultimately builds this power base. It's the area of the kingdom that he turns to in 1397-9 when he's trying to make his power absolute and ensure that he can no longer be challenged. And I think that if we look earlier in the reign as well, we can see attempts to install Ricardians, as I might call them, in positions of power within this region. It's a region, as I say, of substantial private power, so you can very quickly raise someone to a considerable rank just by giving them possession of a couple of these lordships, or by giving them jurisdictional authority over a group of them, or something like that. And so what I'm trying to do is to trace this throughout the reign, and to demonstrate the way in which this ultimately leads to the creation of Richard's landed power base during the tyranny, and to say that, contrary to what some historians might argue, what Richard does during his tyranny is not an anomaly, it's not a sort of a quirk. It was actually inherent in his kingship from the start, that he was always ultimately trying to move towards this.
So this was almost inevitable. Okay, so we've got a very clear picture of what's going on and also about the area that you're researching yourself. But all of these are issues that are heavily contested in the historiography of the period. Do you want to give us an introduction to the main debates and how your work plugs into this?
Sure. So during the 1980s and 1990s, there was effectively an apologist movement within the historiography that tended to argue, for various reasons, that we'd misunderstood Richard and that either he wasn't behaving in a tyrannical way during the late 1390s, or that other aspects of his rule could perhaps be seen to be more sort of forward-thinking. Some people argued that he was effectively the ideological predecessor of the Tudor monarchy because of this sort of emphasis on direct control.
Almost seen as a proto-centralisation.
Indeed, exactly. There are a number of historians who would have argued that that we were misinterpreting Richard and that this was and effectively being too critical of him. Now, I'm really trying to argue against that. A number of historians working on the reign recently have started to look in more depth at the policies, which is obviously what I'm trying to do, rather than just giving a more broader overview of them.
And getting a regional focus.
And getting a regional focus, exactly. And so, for example, if one takes something like the royal affinity, which historians have said, well, this is proto-centralisation, effectively. Well, then, when you look at it in the localities, you realise that everywhere it's being used, used, it's being inserted in a very aggressive manner to the detriment of the existing system of government, and to the detriment in many cases of local order. Because quite simply, if you do this, if you suddenly introduce a rival local power base, a rival structure of authority within a region, it's going to lead to disorder, because it's going to give an outlook for people who have their own grievances, for people who want to make an issue out of something, for people who, for whatever reason, might be opposed to the local earl. And it inevitably results in disorder. These things always spiral. In other cases, the only people who the king can find to retain are effectively notorious criminals who are outside of the local patterns of authority here. This is the sort of this is the sort of thing that Richard's doing. And so when we look at it in more detail, we see that this isn't about centralisation or state building or any of these sort of things. It's about a private vendetta Richard has against a local nobleman, and the way in which he's attempting. He in many ways, in the way in which he is operating himself, Richard is abiding by the sort of the rules of bastard feudalism. Effectively, he is retaining people, and he's only able to do it in areas where he has some sort of land from which to base it. So it's not, as I say, it's not centralisation. It's not about linking this back in. It's a very private vendetta that causes huge problems in the localities in which it's employed, and ultimately causes an escalation in the disputes in national politics. And so, by looking at this in greater detail, we've really started to challenge these apologists and to argue that actually no, this is misunderstanding what Richard's trying to do. And that, as I say, if we then also return to the fundamentals, if we draw up the lists of the ways in which Richard breaks the law over the course of his reign, particularly during the tyranny, but earlier as well, you can see this is a consistent thread throughout. This is a king who has a very strong concept of his own rights and his own power vis-a-vis his nobility and his other subjects. And he doesn't really care for their rights. He's interested in what they owe him, not what he owes them. Not what the responsibilities of his office are, but what his subjects should do for him. He's obsessed with obedience and the notion, and ultimately I think by the end he believes that quite simply he should not be criticised. He cannot be challenged because he is king. And his concept of this is much more extreme than we've seen before. And perhaps we'll talk about that in a minute.
Well, I think one of the most enduring popular characterizations of Richard, outside of the historiography, has to be Shakespeare's Richard II. And I'm thinking particularly of John of Gaunt, where he gives this kind of excoriating speech, and he says, I think he says, "Landlord of England art thou, not king."
Yeah.
To what extent does your work and broader historiography confirm or refute this kind of popular portrait that we have?
Sure. So the example you just picked on there, that Gaunt diatribe, is one of my favourite bits of the play, because I think that is one of the occasions in which Shakespeare really gets Richard to a T. He really understands what's happening here. From the nobility's perspective, that's exactly what it would have seemed like. They understand a king to be someone who is responsible and who has the common good at the heart of what he's trying to do. A landlord, by comparison, is only interested in his private benefit. And that's exactly what Gaunt's accusing Richard of, and that's spot on. Now, other aspects of the Shakespearean portrayal, the slight effeminacy, the directors may or may not choose to bring out.
The most recent BBC
one certainly does, the foppishness. And as well, the extent to which ultimately, because of what Shakespeare's trying to say, he needs to turn Richard into a tragic hero, I think is misguided, and I think engenders sympathy for Richard where perhaps none should be given. What we have to remember is that Shakespeare play is one of those plays that really tells you an awful lot more about the political attitudes of Shakespeare's own time.
Absolutely.
And the disputes in the Elizabethan court. Elizabeth's famous statement, "I am Richard II, know ye not that," after she saw the play. This is really about what's happening in Shakespeare's own time. It's not an accurate reflection of the politics of Richard's day, although, as I say, there are occasional moments in it where certain lines get it spot on.
Fabulous. Well, hopefully this recording and our chats will be able to fix Richard in the popular imagination, knock Shakespeare off his pedestal. So something we're keen to know a bit more about is how you actually get to the realities of Richard's reign, because I think a lot of TV documentaries go straight to, these are our findings, these are what we think, but without giving a real idea of the day-to-day slog and the kind of the materials that you work with. So can you introduce us a bit to the kind of sources that you use?
Sure. Okay, so on the one hand, we have central government records surviving from the period, and on the other hand, we have some local records surviving. Central government records are by and large kept in the National Archives in London, and we're talking about manuscript records, written in Latin normally, and in contemporary handwriting, normally heavily abbreviated. And those are the records of the departments of central government, the Chancery, the Exchequer, the King's Bench, a judicial body, all these sort of things. And we can go to those and we can get sort of the central perspective from those. So we can see what the king and his government are doing, what's being sent into the localities, everything from who's being appointed to as various local officials, to who's being given grifts of land in different areas, to how the King's Bench is operating, and what cases are coming in from the locality to the King's Bench. And what that might tell us about what's happening in local society. Now, beyond that, as well, as I say, we've also got local sources. Unfortunately, in the March, most of these don't survive anymore. These would obviously have been private archives. They would have been the records of the individual noblemen who held these estates, and most of them, therefore, were contained in the basements, effectively, of the castles in the March.
Not by dedicated archivists.
Not by dedicated
not hermetically
archivists.
Sealed. Yeah.
And the problem with that is that during the Civil War, most of those castles were held for the king against Parliament, so they were all slighted, or in many cases just completely demolished, normally destroying their archives with them. So very, very few survive. The ones that survive tend to be those from families that were eventually inherited from lands that were eventually inherited by the crown. So you've got the records of the previous generations. Now, that said, there is enough there to go into detail on some of them. For example, the Earl of Arundel, we know a lot about his sort of 3 or 4 northern Welsh lordships, and we can go into considerable detail on those. But what I effectively have to supplement this with is also source material from the centre looking at the border counties, Shropshire, Herefordshire and Gloucestershire. A lot of noblemen from the March also hold lands in the border counties as well, and so I look at the sort of the crossover and the extent to which they might be using men from the counties in their administration in their Marcher estates, and also obviously, as I say, the March is an area of private jurisdiction. Ultimately, the king's only access route to this tends to be when some of these estates is sheet, when they fall back into royal hands for whatever reason, be it a minority in extinction, anything like that. The counties, by comparison, he has much more of an ability to influence, particularly through the local offices. And so I'm trying to sort of cross the border effectively here all the time and keep this in mind.
So bringing together kind of quite a vast array of different sources.
It's in many ways almost too big a region to look at, but because there are only certain areas of it that I can actually talk about due to the sources surviving, it is possible to form this sort of wider picture based on individual pockets of evidence.
Turning to a different kind of source now, one of the famous artistic portrayals of Richard that survive from his reign is the Wilton Diptych.
Yes.
Would you like to introduce
us?
Yes,
certainly. So, the diptych is now held in the National Archives. What it is a 2-panel altarpiece, a sort of folding object that opens out. Was the private altarpiece of Richard II.
So roughly what kind of size are we talking about?
Oh, it's about sort of the size of... Each panel is roughly A4 size, sort of, that sort of scale.
So something to be carried?
Yeah, it's something to be carried, yeah. It's a wooden thing with painted panels on the inside, heavily embossed with gold and all sorts of stuff. As I say, it's now kept in the National Archives. We know that it was commissioned sometime in the 1390s, in the second decade of the reign. We don't have a precise date for that, though, because we can't quite tell on the Exchequer rolls. What's more, we know that it's pretty clear that Richard would have had this with him during the tyranny. So it gives you an idea of the king's mindset. It gives you a way of understanding Richard himself, and therefore helping you to understand the policies he's pursuing, why he's pursuing them, and as I said earlier, how he sees himself and how he understands kingship. Now, on the 2 outer panels of the diptych, we have on the one side, the symbol of the White Hart, which is Richard's personal badge. It's a white hart with a golden crown around its neck. That was his personal emblem. On the other side, we have a helm, which probably is the helm of the Black Prince, his father, with a lion rampant on it and various things. And that's also got the royal arms of England behind it, and the mythical arms of Edward the Confessor, who was the English kingly saint who Richard was fairly obsessed with, and so he impaled the royal arms of England with the mythical arms of Edward the Confessor during this period. That's one of the things that helps us date it. On the inner panels, we have a very interesting scene. On the one hand, you have Richard kneeling, portrayed as a child, which is interesting because, of course, by this point he was an adult. So portrayed effectively as at the age that he was when he first came to the throne, which might tell you something about the way in which Richard considers this kingship to have originally been pure. He's sort of backed up by three saints, two kingly saints, the two English kingly saints, St. Edmund, king and martyr, who was shot full of arrows by the Vikings, and St. Edward the Confessor, and also John the Baptist. And they're sort of, Richard is kneeling, and they're sort of ushering Richard forwards. On the other side, we have the heavenly hosts, the angels, the Virgin, and the Christ child. And as a devotional piece, this is not in itself that unusual. We have other examples of similar sort of things. Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, Richard's father-in-law, has a similar one of these. But when we start to look at it in more detail, we realise it's quite unusual. On Charles's, for example, he's portrayed at prayer with his hands clasped. In the Wilton Diptych, Richard is kneeling, but he's not supplicating. His arms are outstretched, he's looking up rather than his head bowed, and he appears to be opening his arms to receive. On the other side, the Virgin with the Christ child is holding young Jesus out towards Richard, who is gesturing towards him, either in some sort of gesture of recognition, or of greeting, or of blessing. Other features as well suggest that this is implying some sort of a direct connection here. The heavenly host, the angels, are all wearing Richard's badge of the White Hart. Oh, wow. Which is particularly unusual.
The way he ties his own kingship to religious identities.
We can go into it even further. Richard was born on the Feast of Epiphany.
It's January the 6th.
January the 6th, yeah. The three, as I say, saints behind Richard, therefore could be interpreted as magi-like figures. I mean, two of them are kings. And after all, John the Baptist's role in medieval art is normally as the man who recognises Christ, recognises the divine. So on the one hand, you can really see an attempt almost to claim some sort of a spiritual brotherhood going on here. I mean, there has been a really extreme interpretation of it that's effectively said that Richard thinks he's Jesus reincarnate. I don't think that's true.
But there's an element of identification.
There's an absolute element of identification and a very clear element of blessing. Now, this might seem to tie into what people would call divine right theories of kingship. Now, I personally don't like that phrase because that tends to be associated more with Stuart kingship and with the debates surrounding the Civil War. And I don't think that
it's anachronistic.
It's anachronistic to apply that to the Middle Ages. What is, however, without a doubt, is that kings are anointed. They are deemed to be the Lord's appointed leader of the polity. And Richard clearly takes this very seriously. But as I say, if we look at this, the extent to which Richard is claiming this direct link is incredibly unusual, and it suggests that this is a man who has a very firm conception of his own rights, a conception of kingship which suggests purity, which suggests that ultimately Richard came to the throne as a child and was pure in that, and that his kingship has been sullied by the events which has happened ever since, particularly by the noblemen who've opposed him, and that he is ultimately trying to return it by the policies he's pursuing to this position of purity that it originally enjoyed. And this gives you an idea of what this man was like. It gives you an idea of what it must have been like to try to work with him. Imagine being a nobleman. I mean, at the end of the day, the medieval nobility are incredibly, generally very pious individuals. But they're also resolutely practical people. And to try to engage with someone who has this conception of themselves, who is in a position of power over you and who therefore believes that he is unchallengeable and that you don't necessarily even have the right to question his decisions, because that's what kingship really entails for him. You as a subject should just obey. You shouldn't question him. Imagine trying to work
the
with
lines of the crises that emerged during the reign of Rome.
You can see from the diptych, I think, how these things started to break down, how the relationship between the king and his subjects really fell apart, and why the events of the reign happen as they do.
So as we near the end of this, I mean, we've got an idea of how the tyranny works out in 1397 to 1399. I suppose the last big question is, what happens next? I mean, Richard seems to have upended the organisation of the kingdom, even some ideas of kingship and its relation to religion, its relation to power, in the regions. What happens next after he's deposed, as you say, dies in Lancastrian custody, and the new king comes in? Does he ditch all of these policies? What happens next?
Sure. So when Henry Bolingbroke comes to the throne, when he becomes Henry IV, he effectively promises not to rule as Richard II had ruled. Probably is not surprising. And he doesn't. What he certainly doesn't do is he doesn't break the law in the way Richard did. But Henry, as I say, was heir to the Lancastrian estates, and so he does have the Duchy of Lancaster as a private resource to reinforce his kingship, which has never happened before. And there is no denying the fact that Henry uses the Lancastrian affinity, in particular the body of men personally retained to him as Duke of Lancaster rather than as king, uses them as a private resource to rule areas of the kingdom. Now, he doesn't do it in a confrontational manner, generally. He doesn't do it in an aggressive manner, and he doesn't do it to try to exclude or outcast members of the nobility whom he disagrees with. But you can't deny, nevertheless, that this is perhaps more what you might call magnate kingship. Now, Henry IV is ultimately succeeded by Henry V, who does turn his back on these policies. Henry V rules much more like Edward III or Edward I had done before him. He rules much more according to what we think of as typical late medieval kingship, and he makes very little use of the Lancastrian affinity as a private resource. He allows it to continue to run the areas in which the Lancastrian estates are the dominant local landed estate, but that's natural. That's what you'd expect to happen. And it's not being done with the implicit backing of royal power. It's rather sort of bastard feudalism, but the bastard feudal lord just happens to be the king, rather than that being essential to the reason why it's being done in the first place. Now, ultimately, what changes this, though, is the Wars of the Roses, is the fact that Henry VI, for various reasons, is a completely incapable king, and is ultimately deposed by another magnate, Edward IV, then Edward Earl of March. And Edward IV, again, does rule like a magnate. There's absolutely no denying this. The affinity, the royal affinity, becomes a much more important part of government, and ultimately this does lead to a greater degree of what we would call centralisation, which is then taken to a far greater extent under the Tudors.
Really speeds up under Henry VII.
Really speeds up under Henry VII, because again we have there in Henry VII a king who fundamentally distrusts his nobility, and who is, to all intents and purposes, paranoid in the policies he pursues, and is to the extent that the central institutions, the chamber and things, start to play a completely different role in government. Now, that is not a natural progression of medieval government. That is something that...
So Richard isn't starting
Richard isn't starting this. This is what needs to be emphasised here. Richard is trying to pursue a particular set of policies because he hates certain of his own nobility. The way in which it develops during the 15th century is very specific to the conditions of the 15th century and the nature of the people who ultimately take the throne for various different reasons at the time. This is not a natural progression. It's a series of tangents that ultimately ends up in a position where it looks like the foundation of the modern state. It looks like a greater degree of centralisation. What's partially inherent in that is, as I say, the fact that the crown along the way inherits the Lancastrian estates and then ultimately the Duchy of York as well, the two largest landed estates in the realm. So the crown is directly ruling areas of the kingdom that it didn't used to. So this is, to some extent, inherent in that.
This is by no means...
But it's by no means a natural progression. It's not certainly not what Edward III, in his delegated rule, was attempting to bring about. And, it's something that Richard would have enjoyed, it's something that Richard would have appreciated. And when I teach Henry VII, for example, I tell students that, they want to think back to Richard II. They are in some ways pursuing similar things, but he's not an ideological precursor. The notion that Richard is trying to found the modern state is completely anachronistic. That's not what it's about at all.
Well, that's fantastic. I want to thank you for putting Richard II in his time and in his context. It's been a really, really interesting chat. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thanks.
Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us and for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at crash, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.